Hi, I'm Ali Eilot from Heritage Estate Planning, and today I've jumped on to do a video about mental capacity. As a professional will writer, it is super important that when taking instructions from someone to do a will, that we're really sure that they have sufficient mental capacity to make that will. And the overriding rule that we kind of work by, so our guiding principle, is something called the golden rule. The golden rule really states that the onus for ascertaining mental capacity is very much in the hands of the will writer. So if for example, I'm seeing somebody, particularly someone older, or someone that's vulnerable in another way, perhaps they've gone through a bereavement, or they've got a period of time where they've had mental illness, or they are seriously ill. Those are all kind of little triggers and little alarm bells to make sure that that person understands that they're making a will, and they've got sufficient mental capacity to do that at this particular moment in time. And if I'm ever in doubt about that, so once I've been to see someone, if there's something, either a gut feeling or something that they've said, or the way that they've said things, that leaves me in any doubt, it's my duty to make sure that I call in a specialist of the mind or brain, really to make an assessment, a proper assessment on whether they are able to make that will or lasting power of attorney. And there's a company we've worked with for several years that I trust to do those assessments when needed. And thankfully, we don't have to do them very often, but it is very important that we understand when those assessments are needed. Because later on, when it counts, when the will's needed, the last thing that anyone wants is for that will to be challenged and there not be enough evidence on file to explain why the will was written in a certain way, and the environment that that will was written in. So that's the guiding principle. And when we're taking instructions for a will, we're really looking back at a particular case in history called Banks and Goodfellow. Which was a case heard in 1870, so a very, very long period of time, but it's still the case that the courts will look at when a will is challenged on the grounds of mental capacity. So that's the test that we use, and it's comprised of 4 key elements. I'm going to run through those now for you. So the 4 key elements are: the testator, the person making the will, must understand that they are making a will, and the effect of that will. So it sounds really obvious, but they must understand that they're making a will which deals with their estate and what happens to it after they die. It's a document that sets that out. So they must understand that firstly. The second thing they must understand is the extent of their property. So they don't need to know to the nearest pound and pence the value of every single item that they own, but they do need to understand the extent of their wealth and what comprises their estate. So whether they own property, or they've got savings or pensions or investments, shares, they must need to have an understanding of their overall wealth. Because if you think about it, you're writing a will disposing of those assets. So it's important that the person writing it knows what they're dealing with and who they're leaving things to. Which brings me on to the next point. I call it who, but it's really, does the person understand who might have a moral claim against their estate? So who would they be expecting to leave things to? Who is expecting? Sounds really bad to say it like that, doesn't it? But who would be expecting to receive an inheritance? So it could be as simple as drawing a family tree, understanding their close relatives, their close family members, and really exploring who they're leaving that estate to. And particularly digging down if someone's being cut out. So, for example, if one of their children isn't going to be a beneficiary in the will, really understanding why and getting the reasons documented appropriately. And the 4th point is they must not be suffering from a disorder of the mind or brain that is going to impact on making a decision about the will, so impact on them writing a will. So just because someone has suffered mental illness, as actually in the case of Banks and Goodfellow, that was indeed the case. Mr. Banks had been in an asylum at one point and definitely was suffering with delusions. But did that disorder of the mind, does that impact on what they are doing in relation to their will? So it isn't always the case that we can't write a will for someone that has been suffering mental illness, but it might be a trigger point to have a much deeper conversation to understand the extent of that illness and how it is affecting decision making. So they're the four key points. There is also something called the Mental Capacity Act 2005, which you may be aware of. And there are four key principles in that as well, which can sometimes be used to cross-check Banks and Goodfellow. It's not completely different, but it is slightly different tests, I suppose. So I'll run through those 4 points as well. So the Mental Capacity Act says that the person making the will must understand the information relevant to making that decision. They must be able to retain that information long enough to make that decision. And they must be able to use or weigh that information to make a decision, and they must be able to communicate that decision. So sometimes the law looks at those two in conjunction with each other, but mostly as a professional will writer, we're most interested in Banks and Goodfellow. And the key piece of advice I'll leave you with is, please use a professional when drawing up your will, whether that's a solicitor or a professionally trained and qualified will writer, to ensure that your wishes are accurately documented in a will, but more importantly, that the evidence is kept in file notes as to why you've made those decisions. And please try and make your will while you're fit, healthy, and not suffering from a disorder of the mind or brain, because it does make things a lot easier. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you soon.